Today, we're going to finish the advanced button shader that we started last week. Let's go. Alright, so we're in the middle of a series of videos on creating procedural shapes and patterns. Last week, we started making this really cool looking aqua style button. I'll put the playlist for the whole series down in the description so you can catch up if you haven't seen the previous episodes. So we've got a pretty nice looking button here, but it's missing a couple of things. First, it needs some translucency and a drop shadow down here underneath it. And then we need to give it some states. It needs a moused over state and a pressed state so it can respond when the user interacts with it. When we started making this button, we copied a previous version, so let's start by deleting all of this stuff down here that we don't need. There's a whole bunch of nodes here that we're not using, so I'm just going to delete all of this, and delete all of this, and just delete all of this. There we go. Now we have a little bit cleaner workspace to work with. So let me just give you a quick tour here. This portion of the button creates the UVs and then moves the UVs when the button is pressed. We're going to get back to that in a minute. This portion of the button creates the mask for the shape of the button. And I have both the filled shape and an outline shape that we may use later. And then up here, we have the portion that defines the color of the button. And these nodes here create this nice Fresnel outline around the button. And then up here at the top, we're creating the specular highlight that creates this nice reflection at the top. And like I said, the next thing that we need to do is add translucency and a drop shadow. Let's start by adding the translucency. For translucency, I'm basically trying to create a mask that determines where the button is transparent or translucent and where it's opaque. So to do that, I'm going to start out by taking the button color that I've created here and desaturating it. So I'm going to add a saturation node and set my saturation to 0. And this gives me a black and white mask that's a good starting place for my translucency. It's less translucent here at the top. Or more translucent here at the top and less translucent at the bottom. And I actually want the opposite of that. So I'm going to add a 1- node. And that will make it more translucent here at the bottom and less at the top. And now I'm just going to add a value here. This is a value that I can use to control how much translucency I've got. So I'm going to add a value of 0.13, and that's going to make it less translucent. But if I reduce this value, I can make it more translucent. Cool, so I've got a little bit of translucency control there. And now I need to make sure that wherever I'm getting this specular highlight here, that reflection is nice and bright, and it's not translucent in that area. So I'm going to grab my reflection here and bring it down and add it to my mask as well. And so now I've added that specular highlight in here, and so that will make sure that wherever that specular highlight is happening, I'm not getting translucency. And then the last thing that I need to do is combine it with the button mask that I've got here. And so what I'm going to do is add a minimum node. And what this is going to do is give me whichever value is smaller between my button mask and my translucency. So there I have a nice translucency value, and I can use that, but I need to include the drop shadow in it as well. So that's what we're going to do next. I'm going to go ahead and minimize these nodes and just kind of clean this up here, and then we're going to create the drop shadow for our button. All right, so let's create the nodes for our drop shadow here. The first thing that we need is a new rectangle SDF node. So I'm going to come in here and add our rectangle SDF. And there it is. And the first thing that we need to plug in here is our UV coordinates. So I'm going to come over here to our UV coordinates where we've got our UVs coming in. And I'm going to bring them over and I'm going to add a multiply node here. What we want to do is compress our UVs so that vertically the UVs are so that our shape is compressed. Right now we have this nice button and we want to put a drop shadow below it, but we don't want it to be the same height as the button itself because we want it to appear that there's a little bit of perspective. And so I'm going to multiply our UVs by a value of 1 and 1.7, and that is going to compress our vertical UV range. So now you can see that has worked correctly to move our drop shadow down. All right, the next thing that we need to do is create this size value. And for the size, I just need to find my dimensions that I've got coming in here and just adjust the dimensions just a little bit. So I'm going to grab these dimensions and multiply them as well, just like we did with the size. We're going to multiply the dimensions by 0.3 and by 0.01. So I'm going to plug that into my size value. And now you can see I've got a drop shadow that is very tiny, and that's not exactly what I'm looking for. We need to adjust this a little bit as well. And the way that we're going to fix that is by changing our edge max value here. The edge min and edge max value is set up right now to make this a sharp outline, but what we really want for a drop shadow is for it to be a little bit blurry, actually a lot blurry. And so I'm going to set this edge max value to 0.5. And now with that value set, you can see that we've expanded out our value quite a bit and created something that looks a lot like a drop shadow. Very nice. The next thing that we need to do is set our corner radii value. And the way that we do that is by taking our size value here and wiring the G of the size into that. So I'm going to add a split here, and we're going to take the G or the Y value and plug that into the corner radii. Okay, so I think we're all set for the shape of our drop shadow. Now we need to create the color of our drop shadow. Normally you think of a drop shadow as being black and white or just kind of darkening the area underneath the object. But in this case, our button is translucent. So we have light coming through the object, and so the drop shadow is actually going to be colorized by that light passing through it. And so we need to create some color for our drop shadow shape that we've created here. So for the color of our drop shadow, we're going to grab our brighter color here, and we're going to bring it down. And we're going to multiply this color by 0.5 just to dim it down a little bit. So we have a dimmer version of the bright blue color. And we're also going to take our drop shadow mask that we've created here, and we're going to multiply it by 0.5 to dim it down as well. And then we're going to take the result of our color dimness and our mask dimness and multiply the two of these together. And this combination is going to give us a nice tinted drop shadow. Okay, so now we need to take what we've created with our drop shadow so far and combine it with the color of our button here. And the way that we're going to do that is with a lerp. So I'm going to lerp between our button color and our drop shadow color using the mask that we created for our button. So I'll wire that up here to our lerp. And boom, now you can see we've got a nice looking button here, and we've got a nice looking colorized drop shadow underneath it. That's looking really nice. I really like where that's going. Okay, so let's go ahead and wire this node up to the color output for our button. And now we need to create the alpha output for our button as well. So here's our translucency. That's our alpha output. But we need to add our drop shadow into that. So I'm going to bring this over here. We're going to add in our drop shadow from here. And now we have a nice translucent button with a drop shadow underneath it. And we can wire that out as our alpha. All right, beautiful. And if we open up our preview, now you can see we've got a really nice looking button. And the last thing that we need to do in the tutorial is add the different states to our button. We need to add a pressed state and we need to add a moused over state. So for the moused over state, we want to add some animated sheen, like there's a reflection that's moving across the button. So when my mouse is on the button, it's going to create this animated sheen. Last week, we went on a bit of a detour, and I showed you how to make the animated sheen subgraph. If you haven't seen that video yet, I'll link it down in the description so you can catch up. But now that we've made it, all that we have to do is drop it in. And so I'm going to come over to this part of my graph here and hit my space bar, and I can just type sheen, and there it is, our animated sheen subgraph that we created last week. So you can see I've got this nice animation going on here. And there were a couple of things that we forgot to do with our animated sheen. So let's just double click on this, jump into the animated sheen subgraph, and we just need to finish it off here. So where it says animated sheen subgraphs, I'm just going to come over here and type procedural patterns. And then over here in my graph settings, I'm going to set my preview to 2D. Somebody pointed that out in the comments last week. Thanks a lot for that. And now back in my button, you can see that my animated sheen has a nice 2D preview going on here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the UV coordinates that I've generated for my button. Here are my UVs, and I'll just connect them up there. And then for my animated sheen, I'm going to set my scale to 0.1, 0.1. And that's going to give it just a little bit longer sheen amount and just a little bit longer dark amount. And then I'm going to set my tilt to negative 0.4 to kind of tilt it over a little bit more. And I'm going to set my speed to negative 0.7 to make it go just a little bit faster. All right, so I've got my animated sheen set up there. I want to dim it down just a little bit. So I'm going to take that value and just multiply it by 0.7, just so it's not quite as intense. And now, in order to make it turn on at the right time, I'm going to open up my blackboard here and come over, and I'm going to grab my selected Boolean and bring it in. So when the button is selected, or in other words, when you've moused over it, I'm going to multiply it by that selected value. So when selected is false, it's going to get multiplied by 0 and just basically turn it off. And when selected is true, it's going to get multiplied by 1, and that means it'll be on. And so now, right here where I'm creating the color of my button, for this lerp, I can just bring my animated sheen right here and just add it in. All right, so that's what my color looks like with the animated sheen, but obviously this selected value defaults to false. So in order to see what it's doing, I have to set this default value to true, and now we can see that animated sheen effect happening. I'll just leave it like that for now, just so that we can watch and see what it's doing. But let's go ahead and connect it up to the rest of the button. And we'll come over here to the end result. And now you can see what the button looks like when I hover my mouse over it. So when the selected state is true, it's going to look like this with this kind of animated sheen effect happening. Pretty cool. All right, next let's work on the pressed state. So let's just set this value back to false again. And first, for pressed, I'm going to come over here to our UV coordinates. And right now, you can see we've got this pressed state here, and we branch off of the original UV coordinates depending on this pressed state. So if pressed is true, we're moving our UV coordinates down and to the right. And what I want to do for this button is actually just move them down and not move them to the right. So I'm going to set X to 0, and I'm going to set down just a little bit higher. I think maybe I'll set it to 0.05. Okay, so let's come over here to the end result of our button, and we're going to set the pressed state to true, just temporarily. So if I select our pressed button and set our default value to true, now you can see we're toggling back and forth between when the button is unpressed and when it's pressed. That looks pretty cool. The button is going down, which looks correct to me, but I think that we should maybe modify the colors a little bit just to give it a little bit more spice. And so what we're going to do, first of all, is we're going to get rid of this highlight color, because if the button is pressed, that means your finger is on top of the button, which means you wouldn't be able to see that reflection. Your finger is actually occluding the button. And so let's go ahead and set that up. Right here is where we're adding that specular highlight color to the rest of the button. And so what I can do is bring in my pressed value here, and I can add in a lerp based on my pressed value. So when pressed is true, we're going to use this value. Actually, when pressed is true, we're going to use the value without the specular highlight. And when it's false, we're going to use the value with the specular highlight. All right, so let's come over here again and take a look. We'll select our pressed button and set it to true. And now you can see our specular highlight turns off when our button is pressed. All right, let's actually do one more thing with our pressed state, just for fun. Right now we've got our dark blue color at the top of our gradient and our light blue color at the bottom of our gradient. Well, what if we inverted that value when our button was pressed? So if we come over here to where we're generating our blue to light blue gradient, this is the gradient value here that we're using to control that gradient. And what we can do is bring in our pressed state and add a lerp node. And when our button is pressed, this is going to be when it's not pressed. But when it is pressed, let's add a 1- to our gradient just to flip that gradient around so that when our button state is pressed, our gradient is inverted. So let's take a look at that. We'll set our state to pressed here, and now our gradient flips around. So if we come back here to the end, so this is our button not pressed, and then we press it down, it really changes up the look of the button. That's cool. Our button's going down, and it's also creating this very different look for when it's pressed. Okay, so we've got our pressed state, and we've also got our selected state, which has this animated sheen. So I think we're just about done. I did want to add one more thing though, and that is for our selected state. I wanted to use the outline of our button that we have down here. So when you mouse over the button, let's add in an outline. And so just this one last thing that we're going to do, we're going to put it on top of everything else. I'll bring in the selected state, and we're going to add another lerp. So when selected is false, we'll use that value. And then when selected is true, we're going to use this value plus the outline. So let's add in a max node. And we'll wire in our outline that we generated over here. So now you can see I've got that nice, cool looking white outline around the edge. And I'll connect that up. And so when selected is true, we've got our white outline. Let's
let's set selected to false. All right, so when we're moused over, our button has the nice white outline around it, and it's got that animated sheen. And then when our button is pressed, our color is inverted, and we get rid of our specular highlight and move the button down so it looks like it's pressed. Okay, I think we're done. So now I can just wire this in to the color output, and we're all set. We've got our complete advanced button. Now the neat thing about this button is we've created it all as a subgraph. So I'm going to save this, and we're going to jump out of the aqua button subgraph, and I'm just going to come in here to my temporary shader again, and we can just type aqua. There's our aqua button. And if we want to see the results of our aqua button, let's just go ahead and delete this one. And now I can wire my color into color, my alpha into alpha. And let's open up our preview here. Nice. So you can see we've got our aqua button. And it looks nice and translucent, and it has a beautiful translucent looking drop shadow as well. So now I could use this button as it is, or I could add multiple buttons. And all I have to do is copy and paste these, and I can align them on the on my canvas here by just using the UV coordinates. By adjusting the size and position of the UVs, I can add multiple buttons to my UI. So that is my advanced button tutorial. We've got a nice pressed state, we've got a selected state with our animated sheen going on there, and we've got an active state too as well. I didn't actually show you how to set that one up, but really all you have to do for active and inactive, when the button's inactive, you just desaturate it so it's not colored. And I'll leave that to you as a homework assignment. I'm not going to walk you through that, but you can set up that active state yourself by just desaturating the color from the button. All right, that's our tutorial for today in Unity. Let's go ahead and switch over to Unreal, and I'll show you how to make this advanced button there as well. All right, here we are in Unreal, and just like we did in Unity, we're going to add a couple of elements to finish off our advanced aqua style button. We need to add translucency to our button. We need to add a drop shadow to our button. And then we need to add the button states of selected or moused over and also pressed. So let's start by adding the translucency. We've got a really nice like crystal glass look going here. And what we want to do to make it translucent is create a mask that says where the button is opaque and where it's transparent, where you can see through it. So to do that, to create that mask, I'm going to start with this node here that has our button color. And I'm going to drag it down here, and I'm going to add a desaturation node. And what this node is going to do is it's going to convert the color of our button from this nice blue crystal color to more of a black and white. And this is what we can use for our mask. And now we have this mask that's kind of darker on the top and brighter on the bottom, but I want the inverse of that. And so I'm going to add a 1- node, and that's going to give me the opposite. And so now I have a mask that is darker on the bottom and brighter on the top. And so this is showing me the areas where the button is actually translucent. Now I want to make sure that it's not ever translucent where my specular highlight is that we're calculating up here. So here's our specular highlight. And so I can grab this and just bring it down here and add it to what I'm already doing. So if we zoom in here and take a look, you can see that now I've got my specular highlight in there, so it'll never be transparent. You'll never see through behind it where you're getting this nice specular reflection on it. And now I need to mask out the outside areas as well. And so to do that, I can just add a minimum node, and whichever is smaller between this value and my original value from over here, this will give me my translucency mask. All right, so you can see that I've got a nice translucent button and it has a specular highlight here and it's almost done, but I also need to account for my drop shadow in here. I need a drop shadow down here. So let's jump out of this and do the drop shadow next, and then we can connect that up with our translucency. Now, normally a drop shadow would just be like a dark shadow underneath it, but this dark shadow or this drop shadow is going to be just a little bit different because our button is translucent. We actually want our drop shadow to be colored. And so in order to achieve that, I'm going to come over here and we're going to take our rectangle SDF node and make a new one. So I'll just copy and paste that rectangle SDF. And this is the version that I'm going to use for my drop shadow. And the first thing that I need to do is set up my UV coordinates. So I'm going to come up here and these are my UVs. And you can see that I've got my, my movement happening here. So when the button is pressed, it moves down and to the right. That's what's happening here. You can see that. As I'm setting pressed to true, it's moving down and to the right. In fact, what I'm going to do right now is just set this to 0 so that it's only moving down, and we're going to set this to 0.05. And so now, instead of moving down and to the right, it's just moving straight down. Okay, but that was a little bit of a tangent. What I want to do is grab my UVs here before they're getting modified by this moving, because the drop shadow is going to stay where it is. The button's going to get pressed down, but the drop shadow is going to stay still. So I need to grab these UV coordinates. And I'm going to bring them down here, and I'm going to add a multiply because I need to alter them a little bit before we pass them into our UVs for our rectangle SDF. And so I'm going to hold down 2 and click to add a vector 2 node or a float 2. And we're going to multiply these by 1 and 2. And this is going to squish our drop shadow SDF. So let's just wire this in and we'll start previewing this. So now you can see we've moved this up to the top and we've squished it. So basically our UV coordinates have been squished up to the top. And so what we need to do next is add a value to these so that we can modify them and move the drop shadow kind of down to the bottom part where we want it to be. So we're going to add a 0 to the X because we want it to be in the middle where it is. And then to the Y, we're going to add -1, I think is what we want. We'll connect that up. Yeah, now I've got our drop shadow down here at the bottom. So let's just kind of clean our nodes up here. Those are our UVs. Now for our size, we want our drop shadow. Right now, we're just using a rectangle here, and it's got perfectly sharp edges. And so let's go ahead for our edge max. Instead of the default value, which makes sharp edges, I'm going to add a value of 0.5 for edge max. I think 0.01 is what it defaults to, yeah. And so what this is going to do, a value of 0.5, is it's going to make the edges nice and blurry. Okay, now that we've done that, you can see that our size is too large. And so for size, I'm going to add a vector 2 value in here. And for the X, we're going to give it a value of 0.3. And for the Y, we're going to give it a value of 0. And that will flatten it out and make it into that nice drop shadow shape that we're looking for. So this is perfect. This is exactly what we wanted. We've got our great drop shadow there. Now we just need to adjust it a little bit. And we're going to come out of the fill here. And what we can do is just multiply this. We want to kind of tone it down right now because it's a little bit bright. And so I'm going to multiply this by 0.7 just to kind of darken it a little bit. And like I was saying before, because our button is translucent glass, this nice blue crystal glass, it's allowing light to come through, and that light that's coming through is going to colorize the drop shadow. And so what I'm going to do is grab this color here, our brighter blue color, and bring it down And I think I'm just going to multiply it by like 0.5. And then I'm going to take this drop shadow here and multiply it by 0.5 as well. And then we're going to multiply the two of these values together. And this is going to give us our final drop shadow. So let's preview this value here. Yeah, there we go. So you can see I've got this nice blue translucent drop shadow. And now we just need to combine it with the button that we already have. And so what we can do is just come over here and add a lerp. And we can use our button mask here for the lerp. So I'm going to wire that into the alpha of the lerp. So wherever the alpha is white, it's going to give us our button. And where the alpha is black, we're going to want our drop shadow. So let's plug that in. And it looks like it's not working. So let's kind of troubleshoot it just a little bit. Oh, it's not working because I'm previewing that node down there. So if we preview this, perfect. Now we've got our nice button and we've got our drop shadow underneath it. Now it looks like it's off just a little bit. So let's come down here and just adjust it. Maybe the -1 was a little bit too much. Maybe we just need to make it like -0.8. 0.9. Yeah, there we go. All right, and if we come up here to our pressed state, you can see that when we press the button, it moves the button down, but the drop shadow stays put. And that's exactly what we want. Now we need to take our drop shadow here and also combine it with our translucency value that we have here. So for that, I can just grab this value here and add an add node. And we can come over here and grab our drop shadow value and plug it into that add. And if we preview that, you can see now we've got our button and our drop shadow, and I can wire that out as our alpha value. So now we've got our color and we've got our alpha, we've got our translucency, we've got our drop shadow. We're good to go on the visuals for this button. Now we need to add our states. We need to add a moused over state and we need to add a pressed state. Well, from what we were working on previously, we already have this input selected. We have this input active. And we have input pressed over here. Let's work on input pressed first. We already have it, the behavior working correctly where the button moves down, but let's change the visuals up a little bit as well. The first thing that we're going to want to do is when we press this button, our finger is covering the button up. And so what I'm going to do is change it so that this specular highlight here at the top disappears when it's pressed. Okay, so to turn off our specular highlight here, I'm going to add a static switch node. And I'm going to be switching on our pressed value over here. So when our button is pressed, we're going to grab the color of the button before we add the specular highlight. When it's not pressed, we're going to use the version of the button with the specular highlight. So there we go. Now I can just wire this in. And so let's take a look. We come over here and press our button. Now you can see when the button's pressed, the specular highlight goes away because your finger is covering it up. All right, and then the other thing that I want to do is invert our gradient here. We got a really nice kind of dark blue to light blue gradient. And the gradient is driven right here by this set of nodes. And I want to add a 1- here when the button is pressed so that gradient is inverted. And so we can add another static switch here. So when the button is not pressed, we're going to use this value for the gradient. But when it is pressed, we're going to use the inverted value for the gradient, which is this right here. And so we need to connect this switch up to our pressed state, which is over here. So I'll grab our pressed state and connect it to the switch. And now, when we press our button, you can see that it's moving down. the gradient is inverting, and the specular highlight is disappearing. So that is the pressed state. The next state that we're going to work on is the hover state. And in order to do that, we need to add the animated sheen node that we created last week. So let's open our content drawer, come over here to our patterns, and there's our animated sheen. So let's just take that and drop it in. And I think actually what I want to do is grab that animated sheen node and move it up here where we have a little bit more space. So the first thing that we're going to do is come over here and grab our UV coordinates and connect those into the animated sheen. Then we're going to set up values for the tilt, speed, and scale. So for the scale, I want to set a value of 0.1 and 0.1. Let's just preview our animated sheen for now. This is going to show us what that's going to look like. So let's plug in our scale value here. And that's just going to make the scale larger so that there are bigger periods of shininess and bigger periods of blackness. All right, for the tilt value, I think I want a value of 0.4. You can see that it's already tilted a bit by default, but if I plug this in, now it's tilted in the other direction and just a bit more. I think it defaults to kind of a smaller value. All right, and then for speed, I want a value of 0.7. And obviously you can control these and set these to whatever you like, but these are the values that I've selected. Okay, so we've got our sheen value there. And now I think I want to dull it down just a little bit. And so I'm going to add a multiply. And we're just going to multiply it by 0.7, just so the sheen is not quite as bright. All right, and now we need to come down here and combine it with our color. So we're going to use our selected input value. And when it's selected, I'm going to add a static switch and connect up our value there with our selected value. When it's false, we're going to use this color. And when it's true, we're just going to add in our sheen. So I'll come up here, grab my sheen value, and create an add node and wire that into our switch when it's true. Then we'll connect it up like that. All right, so if we preview our button again, there's our preview, and obviously the sheen is off because our selected is false. But when we set it to true, now we've got our nice animated sheen kind of scrolling or moving across the button for it when it's selected. Okay, the other thing that I want to do for my button selection is I want it to have a nice white outline. So when you're moused over it, it's going to have the animated sheen, and it's also going to have a white outline around the edges. Now, if I come down here to my original SDF rectangle node, you can see I've got this SDF stroke coming out, and I don't have this part connected to anything, this anti-aliased 1-. And if we preview this guy, you can see that's our nice white outline. And so it's really easy to add this outline into our node. I can just come up here and add another static switch node. And when selected is false, our color is going to look like that. But when selected is true, we can just add our outline to the color we've already got. So here's our outline down here. I can bring it up and connect it in and set that to true. And let's set our preview back to our end output node there. And if we come over here and set selected to true, now our button's got a nice white outline, a cool scrolling, moving, animated sheen, and we're all set. So we've got our selected state there, and we've got our pressed state here, and we're good to go. This is looking great. Okay, so that's our advanced aqua style button. And since we've got this in a material function, you could throw this material function into another material and clone that button multiple times if you wanted to, if you wanted to add multiple of these buttons to your UI, or you could just use it as it is. But this is a great way of making a cool looking UI in the style that you choose. You know, you've got all the control because you created all these effects in the shader. And not only that, but these buttons are, infinitely scalable. You can display them on an 8K screen or a tiny mobile device, and you're not using any texture memory either. So there's a lot of great benefits to creating UI elements and other shapes and patterns procedurally like this. I hope you enjoyed our tutorial today. Come back next week. We're going to continue on this series of creating procedural shapes and patterns, and I hope you have a great week.